All right, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time of day you happen to be watching this video. Today we're going to be talking about graphic novels. We're going to be talking about the role that graphic fiction plays in our current culture. And we're also going to give you a crash course on how to read graphic fiction, how to get the most out of modern and emerging types of graphic fiction. So why am I here to talk to you about this today? My name's Kent Tonkin, and I am a lifelong comic book fanatic. I currently teach a course at St. Francis University called The Dark Knight Decoded, where we go back to 1939 and explore over 80 years of Batman history. We really get into why this character has endured, why graphic fiction has endured, why people have taken such interest in a character that's been around for such a long time. As a comic book fan, I was honored back in 2012 to have been drawn into a comic book myself. That shows my enthusiasm for this subject and for graphic fiction in general. Today we're going to be talking about a lot of parts of graphic fiction. The main goals of this presentation are to give you some basics. If you're a first-time reader of comics or graphic novels, how do you interpret this stuff? What is graphic fiction all about? How do you read it? We're also going to be getting into the history of graphic fiction and the growth of graphic fiction as adult and contemporary mediums. Now, do keep in mind, if you only get through the first part of this presentation, the basics of reading graphic fiction, you're ready to start reading. You can stop right there if your interest is over at that point. I do encourage you, though, if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the history of where graphic fiction comes from and why it's so prevalent in American society today, even though it took some time to gain a toehold, the other two sections may be interesting for you. But let's jump right in. We're going to start off with what it takes to read graphic fiction. This diagram is a pretty good example of what it takes to read graphic fiction. Because we are a Western culture, we do read from left to right. So left is generally the start of a line. Just like you would read a line of text, like this citation from left to right, you would read the comic book panels left to right themselves. Typically, by the time you get to the end of a page, you go back to the beginning on the left and do the same thing again, the same way that you would type. In graphic fiction, one of the things that's amazing is that the pictures tell part of the stories. Words tell part of the story as well. We're going to talk about how to interpret those words as part of this process. But graphic fiction is generally left to right. Now, there are exceptions that we're going to show you in terms of the ways that these rules are sometimes broken. These are things that can be sometimes intimidating to first comic book readers. So let's look at some basics. If we see a dialogue bubble, something we're all very familiar with from Photoshop or PowerPoint, whatever medium we're using, that means that somebody is talking. And generally speaking, who the arrow, the point of the bubble is pointing to is who is speaking. And again, for the sake of making things linear, generally in comic panels, the person who is speaking first will usually be positioned further to the left. If you've ever read a comic strip in a newspaper, very similar kind of concept. Then we have the always popular thought bubble, and that just basically means these are words or thoughts that the character is experiencing that nobody else can hear beside the character. Pretty self-explanatory. The third one, however, is something that can be a little open to interpretation. We're talking about what we refer to as narrator blocks. One of the cliches that we always talk about is meanwhile in Gotham City or meanwhile in Metropolis. That box can be used as the voice of the narrator. It can be somebody trying to tell you something that's happening in the scenario, describing the scenario around you, or it can also be the thoughts of the character. Some modern artists prefer to use dialogue boxes or narrator blocks as opposed to thought bubbles to show what somebody is thinking about. So here's an example from one of the books we're going to be reading together, Mom's Cancer. We start off with a full panel block for the narrator at this point. These are the thoughts of the narrator, or he's at least bringing us up to speed on what's happening. Amid the flood of phone calls and appointments, Mom calls a family meeting. It's time to discuss some things. So we're setting the scenario in this dialogue box that could be, again, narrator block, or could be the thoughts of the author. In this case, it's both. We start again reading from left to right. The neurologist consulted with the pulmonary oncologist. They say it's lung cancer that spread to your brain. We have an appointment at Impressive Hospital on Thursday when they'll take it out. So we finish the first line, we go to the second line, and start again on the left. They don't even know what it is yet. It's a brain tumor, but the real problem is lung cancer. You notice real is put in bold. The real problem is lung cancer. least it's just a stage 4. You know stage 4 is bad, right? Why isn't mom getting any of this? We see the G's and the why isn't mom getting any of this on the bottom line. Those are the thoughts of the narrator, in which case happens to be the author, who has written this comic, this graphic novel, as a memoir to his experience dealing with his mom with cancer. To get a little more superheroic, this is an example of a non-traditional panel layout. This is an old-page panel from the class of 1986 comic book, The Dark Knight Returns. And here we see the thoughts of Bruce Wayne, Batman. This should be agony. I should be a mass of aching muscle, broken, spent, unable to move. And were I an older man, I surely would. Then we go over to the right. You can see that we've got television panels here that they're talking about the reappearance of Batman after a 10-year absence. And it gets a little confusing because that's happening at the same time of his thoughts. What this means is occasionally you get into complex panels like this, you might need to read them several times. We're still moving left to right, top to bottom, but not necessarily linear. This is a very non-traditional panel layout. Probably not what you'll experience in most of the work we're going to be reading together. Let's go to another non-traditional layout. This is again from the comic Mom's Cancer. And this full panel simply gives us a diagram of what mom is experiencing in terms of her chemotherapy and some of the ways that she's had to adapt. You'll notice here that there's some subtle things that are being conveyed. In addition to the things that are being detailed, such as the syringes and the fact that she's got chemicals being pumped into her veins. You know, she's also got what appears to be a remote control in her hand, so she's been watching television. We also notice her face looks very tired. She's fallen asleep watching television, and she's got a blanket on her. Her facial expression implies weariness. The old cliche is a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this is what is so darn special about graphic fiction, is we can communicate so many of these things without saying anything, even though the words do help us here. And one more example, we've got another non-traditional panel layout where we've got the idea of subtext. So in this particular area, for example, the author is saying every important conversation is 2 parts: the text of spoken words and the unspoken subtext, and what those words really mean. In this case, this is the author having a conversation with his estranged father, who is divorced from his mother, about her cancer. So you can see that we have what the characters are saying on the top, and on the bottom in the black panels, we see what they're actually thinking. Again, this is a very artistic and very communicative part of graphic fiction that allows us to really put multiple layers of human interaction in the same spot. That's one of the beauties of graphic fiction. Again, this isn't superheroes. This is a daily life conversation in the lives of 2 people who are dealing with cancer and a loved one in a very different way. Pretty interesting how this can be conveyed. So that's really the basics of reading graphic fiction. If you had to get started reading that graphic novel, you could turn off this presentation now and actually dive in by remembering to read left to right, top to bottom. Remembering what the different thought and word balloons actually mean. Remembering to look at the expressions of people. Some artists do a better job than others of making different characters look wildly different so we can tell them apart. It's a common problem with first-time comic readers that all the characters tend to look the same because of somebody's art style, for example. It can be very challenging. That's also one of the reasons, by the way, that in comic books, at least in the old days, we would see the characters would wear the same clothes all the time. So that way we could identify them more easily, and it was easier for the artist to be consistent. So that being said, we're going to move on to the history of graphic fiction and comics in general, and why it has become a new medium, and how it gained a toehold as an adult medium in the United States. So let's continue. So comic books really have a history as old as the human history of communication. If we look at the earliest human communications, the recording of events, we're talking cave paintings or hieroglyphics. All this was the idea of telling history through pictures. Before we got too far into the middle of the last few centuries, we got into things like political cartoons and postcards. We very much enjoy using graphics to communicate, but we didn't always treat this as literature or fiction. So the first, for example, actual comic book was The Adventures of Obadiah Old Buck, which was written in Switzerland. And it was written more like a political cartoon. We have pictures with words underneath them. So an adult picture book. This book happened to be more satire, but it's pretty interesting that as much as we identify comics as being an American art form, they really started in Switzerland by most accounts. We get into the late 1800s, the last part of the 19th century, and we had The Yellow Kid, which is one of the most famous comic books, or comic strips, I should say. It was controversial because two publishers both wanted The Yellow Kid in their papers, and when the artist jumped ship from one publishing company to another, both publishers were running their own version of The Yellow Kid at the same time. To give you some idea of how this has changed in terms of the content has changed, here's a typical Yellow Kid strip from the late 1800s about cockfighting. So we can see a lot of the times, for example, the Yellow Kid's expressions or dialogue even were written right on his long, strange-looking shirt. So times have changed. The first actual comic books as we know them today came to us in the early 1930s. Famous Funnies was really just a reprint of newspaper strips. So back in those days, a lot of comics were printed in the daily newspapers, and those were thrown away. So people could buy volumes of these, which they might want to keep for longer periods of time. But it was still really regarded as a disposable medium, wide variety of content, everything from action and adventure to comic strips. Some of the common subjects, for example, were things like sci-fi, Flash Gordon, or Famous Funnies, stereotypes, not stereotypes, but stories about current events, football, sporting events, etc. But we also did see a lot of ethnic stereotypes as well, unfortunately, because this was also the lead up to World War II. We could do an entire lecture just on propaganda and stereotypes, which is beyond the range of this particular presentation. Well, everything changed when we got to 1938 in Action Comics #1, The Rise of the Superman, and not even a year later, we had Batman gracing the pages of Detective Comics #27. If you're fortunate enough to own either of these, you could probably retire at will. These are really sought-after collectibles and very different versions of the superheroes that we know today. This is really where people started getting crazy for comic books. So the first superheroes were a lot different than we view superheroes today. Some of them had their origins in radio, for example, like the Green Hornet or the Shadow. Marvel Comics started out at this time too, but they weren't called Marvel Comics like we know them today. The title of the comic was Marvel Comics, but it was published by Timely Publications. In fact, the drawing you see here on the right is actually the original Human Torch, who was an android and not a good guy. So this was viewed as very disposable literature, but this first part of comic history is called the Golden Age, because it's when comics were new and exciting, and people were jumping into all kinds of interesting content areas. There were some other themes, however, that emerged, and some of them would not bode well for the industry in the long run. Westerns and crime comics were big, as was horror. When we start getting into things such as the panel on the right, we see somebody accidentally killed a woman. We see more graphic types of violence. In fact, some of this stuff is even shocking by today's standards and would also be vilified by a very prominent physician later on in the 1950s. In the war era, however, comics were instrumental in getting people behind the war effort, encouraging them to buy war bonds. For example, we have Wonder Woman storming the Nazi front lines in her first issue of her solo publication, Captain America punching Adolf Hitler on the jaw. It was not uncommon to see these characters pitching war bonds and getting into the war effort. It made sense. Just about everybody at this point in time, including adults, was reading comic books in the United States. A lot of GIs who were at war, who were serving in World War II, relied on them for distractions from their daily duties as well. Well, then we get to the 1950s, and we see a lot of the more controversial comics. These are actual covers from the early 1950s. We can see, for example, a guy beheading a woman in the first issue of Crime Suspense Stories on the right or the left-hand side, and a very famous cover from Mr. Mystery when somebody's about ready to receive a red-hot poker right in the eye. The sex and violence content of these unregulated media were pretty off the charts, and there was a lot of concern. What were people, particularly children, actually reading? To that end, we had a guy named Dr. Warham, Dr. Frederick Warham, who was an MD, who published a very famous text called Seduction of the Innocent. He basically blamed the epidemic of juvenile delinquency in the 1950s almost completely on comic books, given how many people were reading them. He said that there were themes in the comics that were, for example, promoting a homosexual lifestyle with Batman and Robin and Wonder Woman. They also said that Superman was a fascist, equating him to Adolf Hitler. Pretty interesting, considering the two people who invented Superman, the artist and writer, were both Jewish men themselves. So pretty ironic. This, however, led to a Senate investigation. If you'll remember, in the 1950s, what was also happening in this country was referred to as McCarthyism, meaning that if you're running an industry, the last thing in the world you want is more government intervention or investigation of how you're running your business practices, because nobody wanted to be associated with anything involving the Red Scare or anti-American activity. So what did we get out of this? We got a voluntary code called the Comics Code. And this was beginning in 1954. Basically, the industry agreed to police itself. It also agreed to tone down the amount of adult content. And there were really strange rules that came into this work as well. For example, blood, if it was shown in a comic book, if somebody got punched and got a bloody lip, they could not have red blood. It had to be brown. Good always had to triumph over evil in every issue. The evildoers had to be punished. No swearing, no sexual content, nothing that had been powering so much of the industry before. The seal you see is the Comics Code Authority seal, and many publishers simply went out of business. If you could not publish horror comics, you could not have controversial content, how could you possibly remain in business? We're going to see how some of this adult content resurfaced later in different forms. But the Comic Code itself actually outlived its usefulness for lots of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that most people are consuming more intense forms of content on streaming services and the internet than are published in the comics at this point. So the code really kind of lapsed into oblivion because it was no longer really needed based on the standards of the time. So we had the last code book that was published a decade ago. So in this time, though, with the 1950s, what could you do if you were a publisher? How did you stay in business if you couldn't have two-fisted fighting tales of crime and violence and horror comics and all the things that had drawn people in? Well, we got into Westerns. Westerns had been around before, so we doubled back on them. Humor was big, as were romance and sci-fi. Sci-fi, of course, during the UFO craze of the 1950s became a pretty big deal, and a place where it was okay to fight aliens instead of fighting mobsters, for example. There were ways around the rules, and many of the comics and familiar characters like Batman and Superman found themselves in really strange situations. At the same time, we had the emergence of something called Classics Illustrated. It was a great way for many people who did not want to read an entire textbook or read Macbeth, for example, to see it in comic book form. These actually persisted for a long time, 41 to 71. You can still get reprints today. And I would argue that some of these are better than the Cliffs Notes, if anybody knows what Cliffs Notes are, in terms of if you want the abbreviated version of a classic piece of literature, there are worse ways to go than Classics Illustrated. Well, then we get into the second part of the superhero and comic book age called the Silver Age. So we had Marvel really taking the lead. If you had to call the Silver Age one name other than the Silver Age, you could call it the Marvel Age. We had new superheroes who were emerging, and other than the authority figures we saw, such as Batman and Superman, Marvel introduced more human and flawed characters, whether it was Peter Parker as Spider-Man trying to make a living while balancing his superhero life, the Hulk embodying nuclear angst, or the X-Men serving as a surrogate for the civil rights movement. Notice Professor X, Malcolm X. These were tying into what was happening in the world at the time. And young people and young adults took to these themes and really gravitated toward the Marvel books. So that's where we started getting into the Silver Age. We're just at the edge right now, however, of comics and graphic fiction becoming an adult medium. Think about it. We had people who had grown up in the 30s and 40s coming to adulthood in the 50s and 60s and no longer want the simple stories of their youth. They want something bigger and deeper and more interesting to chew on. So where do we go? Let's get into how these became a contemporary medium. Well, in the 60s, you could get around the Comics Code if you published something in the size of a magazine, bigger than a comic book. So the older audiences were drawn to these, whether it was people like Warren Publications or other kinds of publishers who were trying to get in and fill that gap. These were interesting because they were lower cost larger size magazines. They were printed in black and white, and they had very adult themes. You can still get reprints of these really excellent stories. We're talking about really high quality sci-fi, also often tied into the angst of the era. A lot of post World War II and Vietnam themes emerged in these pages. Here are some examples of covers that went with Warren Publications. Obviously, we had the promotion of sex on the Vampirella cover. Vampirella was a vampire heroine. She came from a vampire planet. And she was a vampire, but she was a superhero. Some would argue also an early feminist icon for the comic book industry. Over here in Erie, we had a special, one of the more interesting parts of the time. Of course, we're in the midst of the Cold War and the early 1970s, fear of nuclear Armageddon. And in this version of history, Hard John Apple is a man who's amassing the remaining nuclear weapons after World War III to finish the apocalypse. These are not themes you would typically see in traditional comic books. So this is very hard literary stuff for the time. We also had a large influence from the hippie or the drug culture. If we're getting into Haight-Ashbury, for example, of more experimental kinds of comic books and graphic fiction, things that were challenging readers to really explore things like psychedelic concepts or even metaphysical types of comic books. So there were all kinds of new and emerging themes. Here's some examples of stuff that came out during that era. Art Crumb, if you've ever heard of the artist who created a lot of the look of that era, we did the cover for Zap Comics, for example, and we see the Fabulous Freak Brothers, for example. And these were essentially comic books based out of the West Coast kind of stoner drug movement. So we had a lot of interesting content working its way in. Well, from the 70s and the 80s, the adult comic industry was starting to develop a following. So we had, for example, the idea of licensed merchandising. People couldn't get enough Star Wars. So Star Wars had an entirely second life in the comics. Many of the stories in the comics in the 70s, for example, Star Wars were not even tied into the movies. In fact, conflicting continuities. Some of the other books that you see here are listed. For example, we had Elementals, which is published by a Pennsylvania publisher called Comico, which really got into adult themes. Some of these characters, for example, had relationships with each other or died or were unfaithful to each other. It came down to really adult kinds of things. And then we had publishers like Dark Horse bringing us books like Give Me Liberty, which was exploring the disillusionment with the American dream that came with the 1980s recessions. So then we get to the 90s, and the comic books that had becoming more adult all the time started running out of steam, and we had a darker, more intense tone that was starting to emerge in some of our fiction in the early 90s, and comics also got into the act as well. We had, for example, a publisher emerged called Image Publishing that was separate from Marvel and DC, and it was formed by former artists who wanted to own their own creations, people who did not want to be beholden to large publishers. At the same time, DC and Marvel found themselves in a situation where they needed to reinvent themselves for their new audience, which was also getting older as time was moving on. You also notice during this time, this is Image Publications, Image Comics' first issue of Youngblood. One of those interesting parts about this particular cover is there's no Comics Code seal on it. Image was the first major publisher of traditional comic books that said, we're not going to adhere to the code, we're going to write comics the way we want to write them. DC, as a result, decided to start breaking down their old comic books. These are some scenes right out of 90s DC. For example, if you've seen any of the Batman movies, we know that Batman eventually has his back broken. Well, he had his back broken in the comics first and had to quit being Batman and hand the mantle to a violent and psychopathic predecessor, or I'm sorry, a follower. His idea of not killing people, not using excessive violence, didn't fit with the new 90s aesthetic. We killed off Superman. Aquaman had his hand literally eaten off by piranhas. And then we have characters like Green Lantern turning into villains. Even Wonder Woman lost her title as Wonder Woman, as all these characters were being shaken up and put into darker and darker situations to try to appeal to a thirst by the public for more intense entertainment and, by some instances, more adult approaches to these characters. we get into the 90s, some of these designs do not age well. We see the new Batman, the more powerful, more forceful, more violent Batman. Aquaman literally with a harpoon for a hand. Wonder Woman doing the whole 90s thing, and then Superboy even mixing a leather jacket with his costume. So it was very 90s. At the same time, despite all this other stuff that was happening with the superheroes, DC Comics decided the time was right to have an imprint specifically for older readers. This is a big move to get us into the idea of graphic fiction that wasn't being based off superheroes or existing characters, but it was being created for older readers who enjoyed literature, who enjoyed fiction, who enjoyed high-quality writing, complex characters, and realistic storylines. Unfortunately, Vertigo is no longer with us, ceased publication within the last year, but it changed the way we look at graphic fiction. A lot of underground publishers have been writing adult graphic fiction, particularly in Europe and other countries, but DC's Vertigo line was the first major American publishing to really hit American audiences at large. It had an opportunity for lots of shelf space because DC already had fixtures in comic book stores and even in big box stores, so it was really a big move to get in adult types of literature. Some of these things you may recognize. American Vampire, for example, became a television series, as did iZombie, for example, and The Exterminators. So these are all places where adult interests start hitting into comic books. So when we hit 2000 and beyond, all of a sudden the comic book medium is facing more and more competition from digital media, from tie-ins, for example. And with the amount of Photoshop and digital editing that's happening at this point, is it really still a comic book? For example, companies like Marvel have produced what we refer to as motion comics. We can read them online and panels actually move and are animated. We're competing now with things like video games for the attention of young viewers. So along this line too, guys, one of the things that was kind of happening in parallel, again, based on the tastes of older readers, comic books typically were sold at grocery stores, drugstores, convenience stores, newsstands. Well, we had a movement now for the direct sales market, which meant that we could have comic book stores selling comics directly to the public. What this produced was an opportunity to make more adult types of content, more intense types of content, and to give older readers a place where they could shop specifically for content they were interested in. It is still persistent to this day. We still have a direct sales market, and it really was the way that things started happening. So the golden age of this era, in my opinion, was the 1980s, because we had people, for example, who were starting to go away from traditional bookstores and into comic book stores to get this fiction, to get their more adult takes on superheroes and non-superhero comics. And we also had a number of direct retailers, places like Bud Plant, for example, or Mile High Comics, that were selling directly to readers over mail order, even before most people had internet. What happened during this time? Some of these books you may recognize, because some of these things are now being featured on your local television set. Watchmen was the idea of superheroes being realistic and doing terrible things to each other, and there being consequences for actions, even getting down to the idea of could superheroes cause or avert an apocalypse. It was an allegory for the nuclear arms race in the 1980s. Then we get in, this was an actual Marvel comic published during the 80s called The Nam. Keep in mind, people who had lived through Vietnam were entering the 30s and 40s at this time, and this was a 75-cent per issue full-color comic that gave people an opportunity to experience what it was like to have served in Vietnam. And again, it was written by vets themselves who had been there and gave a very unflinching look at what war was all about. Characters sometimes dying, terrible things happen. Again, a big change in the American psyche. Then we had Marvel also jumping into something called Epic Comics, and that was the idea of producing adult comic books specifically for the United States, but at the same time also importing other comics that had not been published in the States. Things like The Last American or Akira, books that ultimately would be very influential from places like Europe, parts of England and France, or even Asia like Japan. We did have instances where adult content was jumping out for a long time. The social consciousness of Green Lantern and Green Arrow in the 1970s, taking on everything from drug use to race relations in their pages. This is very interesting, especially for the time. We also had a comic book in the 80s called Brat Pack, written by a guy named Rick Vetch, who used to write for DC Comics and become disillusioned with the industry, and did a tell-all memoir on what it was like to be a sidekick. What it really was all about was how the comic book industry itself was losing its innocence, and things like sidekicks, people like Batman and Robin, were really put under the camera eye in terms of, was this a good environment for children? Were the comics themselves a good environment for children? Sandman was written by Neil Gaiman, a guy who has written a lot of movies and television shows that are popular these days. It actually won the Hugo Award for Best Science Fiction, and the literary community was so aghast that a comic book could win this award that they changed the rules the next year so comic books could win. Tried to keep the floodgates from opening, but we got around them anyway. One of the most famous graphic novels of the era, actually a two-part graphic novel by Art Spiegelman called Mouse, and it's Mr. Spiegelman having a conversation with his father about what it was like to be a concentration camp survivor. In his memoir, his father's memories are transferred into an allegory where the Nazis are cats and the Jewish prisoners are mice. Approach with Caution, one of the most intense graphic novels I've ever read, and turning these survivors into cartoonish animal figures, if anything, even makes sometimes their plights even more poignant because Disney characters aren't supposed to die in concentration camps. Garth Ennis, who was famous in the United States for writing some comics that became television shows, such as The Boys and Preacher, wrote a book in the 90s called Troubled Souls about what it was like to try to survive the troubles in Northern Ireland, and it's a very intense read with a not very happy ending, but a good window into what was happening in Northern Ireland at the time. Will Eisner wrote a number of comic books that broke new ground in terms of complex relationships, and even people trying to figure out their own relationship with religion and faith. And Eisner was so big at what he did, he's so good at what he did, that the Eisner Award is named after him for the best independent comic every year. And we also have Miracle Man, started off as Marvel Man in London and in England. And Miracle Man is the idea of what would happen if a superhero actually became a god. And within these pages, this mortal man goes from being a superhuman to being someone to whom people actually pray for miracles. And what would happen, for example, if you as a human being had to cope with the idea that people had begun to worship you. It's an intense read. It's in reprints right now. Absolutely worth your time. American Flag, written by Howard Chaykin, and this was the kind of a backlash to the crass commercialism of the 1980s. This is a version of America where the Plexus Rangers protect human beings who are living in shopping malls while trying to colonize the moon. Pretty interesting stuff. We have Strangers in Paradise, which is one of the first female-led comic books really exploring realistic friendships and relationships between two female lead characters, one of whom also happens to be a contract killer. Pretty interesting comic book, really a fun read. Keeping in line with some of the subject matter we're talking about, Harvey Pekar was one of the movers and shakers of the independent comic book movement by writing an absolutely mundane comic book. Harvey Pekar was a file clerk for the Veterans Administration. He simply wrote a comic book about his own life. Well, when he got cancer, he and his wife wrote a book called Our Cancer Year, which chronicles their year coping with cancer and trying to survive as a couple. Very intense read, not necessarily the most approachable because of some of the strange narratives that go off, but he was still somebody who you should know about in terms of the history of American comics, and to my knowledge, the first American comic book writer to really write about cancer. Well, some of the other things that happened in terms of that movement, we actually had Captain Marvel, the first superhero to die from cancer. You may say, well, isn't Captain Marvel female? Well, in the Marvel universe, she is now, but the original Captain Marvel in the pages of Marvel Comics was a man, and he died in the early 1980s of cancer. We also have, for example, the first openly gay superheroes between Northstar in the Marvel Universe and Midnighter and Apollo in the Image Universe, well, now the Wildstorm Universe, part of DC. If you can see, for example, Midnighter and Apollo are pretty clear analogies to Batman and Superman, and in that version of those characters, they happen to be a gay couple who also are superhumans who are protecting the Earth from all manner of villains. So where are we now? We've got companies like Barnes & Noble, Borders, and we could even talk about Amazon, for example, who are promoting graphic fiction, selling an awful lot of it. So is it good or bad? Well, it's good in the fact that we've got people who have ready access to this type of content. It maybe is not so good in the fact that we've got independent comic shops that have been flying the flag for this content for years, who may not survive the dot-com revolution or the big box revolution. We've got other folks too, for example, whether you're talking about King or Patterson or even Deepak Chopra, who are writing comic books now too. So these are not limited to the comic book authors of the past and the previous approaches to comics. To know the influence of these works, here's a list of some of the movies you may have seen you may not have known were actually based on comic books. And they're not all superhero books. History of Violence or The Road to Perdition, for example, or Ghost World, all based on comic books, albeit less than mainstream comic books. So that's our presentation for today, folks. I really appreciate if you went beyond just the basics of comic reading to get a little bit of a background in terms of how comics are becoming a more adult medium and something that's bigger than just superheroes and science fiction. That being said, I'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, comments about this content, or would like to know more about comic books, you can contact me via email or my office phone. I'm always happy to speak with students, and I can get into long tangents about comic books any day of the week. Hope you have a great day, and I really appreciate your time.